My brother stood up at our family reunion and announced, "Mom and Dad gave me the house, so you're being evicted." I was stunned until the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Actually, that's not what the contract says." When my brother read it, his face went white. I never thought my own brother would do this to me. I mean, sure, we never had the best relationship. Growing up, he was always the golden child, good grades, popular. The one my parents bragged about at church. Me? I was the quiet one, the one who did what I had to do but never got much attention for it. It wasn't like I was a troublemaker or anything. I just wasn't him. But still, we were family. I thought that counted for something. I was wrong. This all started after my parents passed away. Mom had been sick for a long time, but Dad went fast, a heart attack that hit out of nowhere. One minute, he was fixing himself a cup of coffee, the next, he was on the kitchen floor. Just like that, they were both gone within 6 months of each other. After the funeral, my brother, let's call him Mark, acted normal, well, normal for him. He had this weird, smug energy, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. I figured he was just dealing with grief in his own way. Then came the family reunion. Now this wasn't some casual backyard barbecue. Our family reunions were big. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people I only ever saw at weddings and funerals. We held it at my parents' house like we always did, which as far as I knew still belonged to both me and Mark. It was our childhood home after all. That's when he dropped the bombshell. We were all sitting around, eating, drinking, catching up, when Mark suddenly stood up, clinking his fork against his glass like he was making a wedding toast. Everyone quieted down, expecting some sentimental speech about our parents. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "So, I just wanted to take a moment to make an announcement. Mom and Dad left me the house." Silence. What? I felt like I'd misheard him. Maybe he meant to say us instead of me. But no, he kept going. "I've already spoken to a realtor, and I'll be putting it on the market soon. So, you've got about a month to move out." My stomach dropped. Move out? Of my house? I laughed a little, waiting for him to say he was joking. But Mark just stared at me, arms crossed, waiting for a reaction. The room had gone deathly quiet. Even my cousins, who normally never shut up, were just looking between us like they were watching a live episode of some drama series. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark gave me this fake sympathetic look, the kind of face you'd make if you were explaining something to a child. "I know this is hard to hear, but Mom and Dad wanted me to have the house. You've been staying here for free, and that's not really fair, is it?" I was staying here for free? The house we grew up in? The house I had been taking care of ever since Mom got sick? I'd spent years making sure the place didn't fall apart while he was off living his life. I handled the bills, the maintenance, everything. And now he was kicking me out? I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could say anything, I heard someone clear their throat from the doorway. Everyone turned. It was my parents' lawyer. Let's call him Mr. Carter. Older guy, sharp as a tack, and not someone you could push around. He'd been handling my parents' affairs for years, and I guess he was still tying up loose ends. Mark's face twitched when he saw him. Mr. Carter took his time walking into the room, adjusting his glasses, holding a folder under his arm. "Actually," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that's not what the contract says." Mark's smug expression faltered. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice a little less confident. Mr. Carter sighed, flipping open the folder. "I was going to schedule a meeting to go over this privately, but since we're all here, we might as well do it now." He pulled out a stack of papers. "Your parents didn't leave the house to you, Mark. They left it to both of you. 50-50. Mark's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I just stared. I had no idea what to feel, relieved, angry, confused. Mr. Carter continued, "And there's more. Your parents specifically stated that if one of you wanted to sell, the other had the right to buy out their share first. If neither of you could agree, then, and only then, would the house be sold, with the profits split equally." I felt a weight lift off my chest. They hadn't screwed me over. Mark, on the other hand, looked like someone had just punched him in the gut. That's not right," he stammered. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "It's in black and white. I have their signatures right here. You did read the contract before making your little announcement, didn't you? Mark grabbed the papers and started skimming through them, his face getting paler by the second. He flipped page after page, his breathing getting heavier. Then, he stopped. I saw the exact moment he realized he had no way out. His hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened. He knew he had just embarrassed himself in front of the entire family. Everyone was watching. The cousins, the aunts, the uncles. No one was saying a word, but I could feel their judgment. He had tried to kick me out of my own home, and now he looked like a fool. I sat back down slowly, my heart still pounding. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: Mark had seriously miscalculated. And I wasn't about to let this go. Mark stood there, gripping the papers so tightly I thought they might rip. His face had gone from pale to red in seconds. I could tell he was scrambling for something, some way to spin this, some excuse to save face. Then, like flipping a switch, his expression changed. He put on that same smug smirk he always did when he thought he was the smartest guy in the room. "Fine," he said, tossing the papers onto the table. $50.50. Then. That means you need to pay me for my half. I clenched my jaw. I should have known he wouldn't back down that easily. Before I could say anything, Mr. Carter spoke again. "Actually, there's another clause you should be aware of." Mark whipped his head toward him. "What now?" Mr. Carter calmly flipped through the documents and pulled out another page. "Your parents specified that since OP," he nodded toward me, "has been living here and maintaining the property, they are entitled to first refusal rights. That means if they choose to buy, they have the sole right to determine the valuation based on an official property appraisal." Mark blinked. "What the hell does that mean?" I finally found my voice. "It means you don't get to slap some insane price on it just because you're mad." The realization hit him like a brick to the face. He had planned to milk me for every penny. If I refused to pay what he wanted, he could have forced a sale and walked away with a fat check. But now? Now, the price would be based on actual market value, not his greed. And considering how much maintenance I'd been handling over the years, I had a feeling the appraisal wouldn't be as high as he was hoping. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands twitched at his sides. He was boiling inside, but he couldn't argue with a legally binding contract. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The retaliation that night, after everyone had left, I sat in the living room, exhausted. My phone buzzed, a text from my cousin. "Hey, just a heads up, Mark is pissed. He's been talking to Uncle Ray and a few others, saying you manipulated Mom and Dad into putting that in the will." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. Manipulated? Was he serious? I had spent years caring for this house, looking after our sick mother, dealing with bills, repairs, and the stress of keeping everything together while he was off living his life. And now I was the manipulator? I should have seen it coming. Mark had always been good at twisting things to his advantage. He knew that some of our family members, especially the older ones, still saw him as the golden boy. If he spun the story just right, he could turn them against me, and that's exactly what he did. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing the shift. Calls from certain aunts and uncles went unanswered. When I finally got through, the conversations were short, cold. One aunt even said, "I just don't understand why you wouldn't do the right thing and share the house fairly." Fairly? Mark was trying to rob me, and I was the bad guy? Then came the final blow. An email from a lawyer. Mark had officially filed to contest the will. The legal battle begins. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I called Mr. Carter immediately. He wasn't surprised. "I had a feeling he'd pull something like this," he said with a sigh. "Can he actually do this?" I asked, pacing the kitchen. "He can try, but he doesn't have a case," Mr. Carter assured me. "Your parents' will was legally sound. Contesting it would require proving coercion, fraud, or lack of mental capacity at the time they signed it. None of that applies here." I exhaled slowly, gripping the phone. "So what now? Now we play defense. But be ready, this won't be pretty." And it wasn't. Mark dragged our parents' names through the mud, implying that their judgment had been compromised due to Mom's illness. He claimed that I had taken advantage of them, manipulated them into changing their will. He even brought in some distant relatives to give statements about how I had always been controlling. It was disgusting. I wanted to scream, to punch a wall, to do something. But instead, I listened to Mr. Carter and stayed calm. I let the process play out, and slowly, the truth started to crack through Mark's lies. Bank records showed that I had been the one paying property taxes, maintenance fees, and medical bills, while Mark had been spending his money on vacations and cars. Testimonies from neighbors and longtime friends painted a clear picture. Mark had barely been around, while I had been the one holding everything together. When the final hearing arrived, Mark was visibly sweating. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. The judge didn't even take long to deliberate. Mark's claim was denied. I officially retained ownership of the house, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because Mark wasn't done making my life hell. The final betrayal, I thought he'd finally accept defeat. Maybe we'd go our separate ways, not talk for a few years, and then eventually reconnect when the dust settled. But Mark had other plans. One evening, about a month after the court ruling, I came home to find the front door wide open. My heart stopped. I stepped inside cautiously, my hands shaking. The living room was trashed, furniture overturned, papers scattered, drawers pulled open. Then I saw it, my parents' old safe in the corner of the office. The one where Mom kept all our childhood keepsakes, some family jewelry, and, most importantly, the deed to the house. The door was hanging off its hinges. It had been forced open, and everything inside? Gone. I knew it was Mark. I called the police immediately, my chest tight with rage and panic. As I waited for them to arrive, I got a text from Mark. "You should have just sold the house to me. Now you'll see what happens when you're selfish." I gripped my phone so hard my fingers ached. This wasn't over, not even close. Mark had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I stared at the text message, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some petty revenge move, this was breaking and entering. This was theft. By the time the police arrived, I had already checked the entire house. Mark had taken everything valuable from the safe. My parents' old documents, my mom's jewelry, even some of my own savings bonds that I'd stored in there years ago. But the worst part? The deed to the house was gone. The officers took my statement, but I could tell they weren't exactly jumping to action. One of them, an older guy with tired eyes, sighed and said, "If you have reason to believe your brother took it, you'll need to go through the proper legal channels. Family disputes like this get messy." Messy? That was an understatement. The moment they left, I called Mr. Carter. He picked up on the first ring. "He did what?" I could hear the sheer disbelief in his voice. "Yeah," I said, running a hand through my hair. "And he took the deed." A pause. Then Mr. Carter let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, then he's even dumber than I thought." "What do you mean? The original deed? That's just a piece of paper. The legal record is filed with the county. He could burn it, eat it, frame it. None of that changes the fact that the house is yours." I exhaled. I hadn't thought of that. But before I could feel any relief, another thought hit me. Then why did he take it? The fraud. I got my answer 2 weeks later. I received an urgent call from Mr. Carter, who didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Get to my office now." I drove over, my mind racing. When I arrived, he was already standing by the door, holding a thick file in his hands. He slapped it onto the table. "Your brother tried to transfer the house into his name." I felt the blood drain from my face. "He what?" "He took the deed, your parents' original deed, and faked a transfer document. He forged their signatures, had some shady notary stamp it, and then submitted it to the county recorder's office." I couldn't even speak. Mr. Carter kept going. "The only reason it didn't go through is because the clerk handling the paperwork noticed something was off. The signatures looked weird, and the dates didn't line up. So they flagged it for review." I sat down hard. Mark wasn't just playing dirty, he was committing felony fraud, and he thought he could get away with it. The arrest, I didn't waste time. With Mr. Carter's help, I filed a criminal complaint against Mark. I gathered every piece of proof I had, texts, emails, even voicemails where he had threatened to make my life miserable. The authorities didn't move as fast as I wanted them to, but when they finally did, it was swift. Mark was arrested for fraud, forgery, and attempted grand theft. He actually had the audacity to act shocked, and the police showed up at his apartment. I wasn't there, but my cousin, who lived nearby, told me later that Mark kept yelling, "This is a mistake. This is a family matter," as they cuffed him. Yeah, a family matter that could have left me homeless. He spent 3 nights in jail before he managed to post bail. I thought that would be enough to scare him into backing off. I was wrong. The final move: a week later, I got a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, but when I listened, my stomach twisted. It was Mark. "You think this is over? You think you've won? You have no idea what's coming." I didn't know what he meant, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. So I did the one thing he never expected. I sold the house. I hadn't planned on it. This was my childhood home, the place I had fought so hard to keep. But after everything, I realized I didn't even want it anymore. It had turned into a battleground, a symbol of all the pain and betrayal Mark had caused, and, more importantly, I knew it was the one thing that would completely cut him off. I worked fast. I found a buyer within a month, an older couple who wanted a quiet place to retire. The moment the sale went through, I moved out and made sure Mark knew. The best part? His share of the money was automatically deducted for legal fees, restitution, and the damages he caused. He walked away with almost nothing. And me? I walked away free. The aftermath: it's been over a year now. Mark tried to reach out a few times, first with fake apologies, then with more threats when he realized I wasn't falling for it. I blocked him on everything. Last I heard, he moved out of state and was struggling to find steady work. Turns out, having felony charges on your record makes job hunting a little difficult. I won't lie. There's still a part of me that grieves what could have been. We were supposed to be brothers, family. But Mark made his choice, and I made mine. I chose peace, and I've never looked back. Even after I sold the house and cut him off, Mark kept trying to drag me back into his mess. At first, he sent texts, first fake apologies, then angry rants when I didn't reply. Then came the emails, long-winded letters about how I had ruined his life and stolen his future. It was almost funny. He really thought he was the victim. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't done with him yet. Because while he was busy throwing tantrums and blaming me for his problems, I was making sure he felt every consequence of his actions. The final blow: the thing about Mark? He was always reckless, and when people like him get desperate, they make mistakes. A few months after the house ordeal, I got a call from Mr. Carter. "You're going to want to hear this." Turns out, Mark had violated his bail conditions. He was supposed to be staying in state while his case was still active, but he thought he was smarter than everyone else. He had skipped town without telling the court. Big mistake. Because when you jump bail, the legal system doesn't just let that slide. The court issued a bench warrant for his arrest, and now, he wasn't just facing fraud charges, he was officially a fugitive. And that's when I saw my opportunity. I had a friend in real estate who kept tabs on people who skipped town owing money. With a little digging, I found out that Mark was staying with an old college buddy in another state, using a fake address to avoid detection. I didn't even hesitate. I anonymously tipped off the authorities. Mark's fall: it didn't take long for them to track him down. One night, as Mark was out drinking with his friends, cops showed up at the bar. He barely had time to react before they dragged him out in handcuffs. His bail was revoked, and this time, there was no getting out. He was forced to sit in jail for months while waiting for trial. No fancy lawyers, no family support, just him, and the cold, hard reality that he did this to himself. And when his case finally went to court, he lost. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison for fraud, forgery, and bail jumping. I wasn't there for the verdict, but I heard from a cousin that Mark's face went completely blank when they read the sentence. He had spent his whole life thinking he was untouchable. Now, he was just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit. The true ending: that was the last time I ever heard from Mark. He tried reaching out once, from prison. Sent a letter full of fake remorse, begging me to help him. I didn't even open it. I sent it straight back. Mark returned to sender. I had already won. I had my peace. And Mark? Mark finally learned that actions have consequences.